So I've wanted for a while now to make a video on books that hit me like a lightning bolt. And the reason I haven't done that is because while I had a sense of certain books that would definitely be in this category, I was trying to figure out exactly how to refine the edge cases, because I could either limit it to like 3 or 4 books, or I would be looking at like 20 plus books. And so I've hit on 4 criteria that I'm using for what I'm including in this list. And the first of these is, I mentioned in a previous video that there are 3 ways typically that I find books useful. The first is if it introduces me to a new framework, a new way of thinking about the world. The second is if it crystallizes or clarifies something that I was already kind of grasping at. And the third is if it shakes loose some underlying assumptions that I had that I didn't realize I was assuming without necessarily having reason for assuming them. And one thing that unites all of the books that I was certain I wanted to include in here is that they do all 3 of these things. They provide a new framework for thinking about things, they crystallize and clarify something I was grasping at, and they shake loose an assumption I made. The second criteria that I'm using is that it has to have been an immediate impact, because again, I'm describing it as it hit me like a lightning bolt. There's a lot of books that I might describe that way that didn't really impact me in this way, or at least not in all 3 of these ways. So these are books that do both of those things. They meet all 3 of these criteria in terms of being useful, and they were immediately impactful. And so for that reason, there's not going to be any fiction on there, because fiction generally, I mean, it can impact me, but it's generally slower. And I'm excluding a lot of other nonfiction as well, because again, I'm trying to keep this list somewhat short, and even as it is, I ended up with 11 books in this category. And then the third factor is that it has to be the first book that I read that really started to change my thinking on a topic. And a lot of these, because of my habit of reading backwards, they are building on other work that might have been more formative in terms of like the field. But these are the books that really started this transition with me. And they have to be the first book that did all 3. So in one case, I'll have a book that changed my way of thinking about in some respects, but it didn't impact all 3. And then this was the one that first did all 3. And then the final criteria, the 4th criteria, is that there's at least 2 books in my video on gender, possibly 3. Dunbar's Friends I'm sort of on the fence there, but certainly Friends, De Waal's Different, and Bell Hook's The Will to Change would fall into this category. But because I have 2 or 3 books in this video that impacted me that way, and I already talked about them in that video, and it is by far my most watched video. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. But I'm not talking about those books here. So they're books that I didn't already discuss in the gender video. Oh, and the other thing I want to mention is that none of these books, all of them I read 2014 or later. And the reason for that is there are books that might have impacted me this way when I was younger than that, but I have a hard time remembering how they impacted my thinking. And so the book from 2014 that I'll show you, or that I read in 2014, is the earliest one where I really remember how it impacted my thinking, and I remember it hit me this way, and it changed my thinking in all 3 of these respects. So with that in mind, that book is Missing Microbes by Martin Blaser. And so this book is basically, I already knew about the issue of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, but something that I didn't know is that we've wiped out a lot of our gut microbiome, and there are some concerns about it. I mean, I heard people talking about like gut microbiome mostly in terms of, oh yeah, autism is because you have a screwed up gut microbiome, which I think is, as an autistic person, pretty obviously untrue, although I get it because autistic people often have digestive issues. But anyways, he introduces this book explaining that people have gotten taller, and that is probably a consequence of loss of bacteria. And he starts with that because it's not a disease, and so it's something that's easier to accept. And then the thing that really struck me is I was always overweight from like puberty onwards because I had binge eating disorder, which I won't get into, and as I've talked about in some videos. Once I decided to try to do what I thought was healthier and more responsible and shift from binge eating animal products, mainly meat and cheese, to binge eating starch and starchy foods, I gained 180 extra pounds. But I figured that out much later, several years later. This book, until that point, I had just assumed that, okay, I wasn't diagnosed. Binge eating disorder I don't think was even a thing until around the time this book came out. But I knew that there was obviously like a psychological reason behind why I ate so much. And so I just attributed, okay, my weight is, I just need to sort of get in control of the psychological issues I have. And obviously for me, that is a big factor. But for like obesity in general, he makes a case that the microbes in our guts change what we crave and how we process food. And so this was the first time that I really started to think, oh, maybe my issues with weight are not strictly just psychological, which is the way that I think a lot of people treat weight, and there might be something physiological. And he talks about other issues too, like it could be responsible for the increase in type 1 diabetes, which is not connected to like obesity, that's type 2, and celiac disease, and possibly certain cancers as well. And so that was the weight thing, and sort of, I think the factors introduced by the height that really sort of started to change my thinking and maybe realize maybe it's not just a psychological thing here. So I realized as I was editing this video, I didn't quite explain my takeaway here, because it obviously changed after I discovered the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. So after I read this book, I concluded I knew I had binge eating disorder, which I didn't know was a thing. I'm diagnosed now, but wasn't even a diagnosis around the time this book came out. And like I knew I had these habits that were abnormal. I didn't connect the fact that I was gaining more weight to the change in trying to eat starch. And so I concluded I had a bunch of ear infections when I was an infant. So I was on a lot of antibiotics as an infant and as a toddler. And I concluded based on that maybe my binge eating habits were not entirely psychological, although I have reason to think they're psychological factors, but might have been physiological as a result of antibiotics. And then once I discovered the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis, which is the topic of the next book, I realized that the binge eating disorder is why I overeat, and the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis is why when I switched from eating animal products primarily to eating starch primarily, it made me a whole lot fatter. And they were two different factors. And I also think this book sort of primed me understanding the human reaction with the microbiome, the gut microbiome, in a way I hadn't, that it was ecological, for a greater understanding of cybernetic principles and emergent order in general, sort of laid the groundwork for that. And the next book is sort of on a related topic, and that is The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. And so Missing Microbes I read in 2014. This one I read at the tail end of 2018, and I actually wanted to read, I think it was an article in The Atlantic was talking about Gary Taubes' case against sugar, but there was a long hold on the library for that. I think I requested it, because I read this one before Thanksgiving, and I requested Case Against Sugar sometime in November, and I didn't get it until the next year because, again, several holds on it. But this one, the library was suggesting as similar, and it was available. And I went into this expecting, so before I read this, I had started actually controlling the psychological aspect of my eating, because previously, this was the first really successful reframe for me, which if you know about cognitive behavioral therapy, was I was like, I sort of treated, I'm going to eat what I want, like within reason. Again, I was trying to eat less animal products, as this is one of the few areas I felt like I had control over my life. And I'm like, no, I have more control if I'm like eating what I want to, but actually reflecting on and really thinking about it, sort of consistent, I think, a little bit with the idea of intuitive eating. So I was already, like, I'd lost 35 pounds at that point doing that, and I was trying to avoid eating saturated fat and sugar, which I was sort of, everyone had told me, like, saturated fat is the worst thing you can be eating, and I'd kind of suspected, based on my own experiences, that sugar was as well. Like, just, I get migraines, and one of the obvious triggers for that is sugar. And so Case Against Sugar interested me, and then I saw this book, and I'm like, oh, maybe saturated fat isn't as bad as I thought, because growing up, like, all fat was bad, and then we learned actually unsaturated fat maybe isn't as bad. But no, she was actually arguing that saturated fat is healthier than unsaturated fat and dramatically healthier than starch, which was the opposite of what I had been taught. And she laid out the evidence that there was a lot of basically academic fraud on this topic as a result of, well, it started with Ansel Keys and Fred Stair, and then the federal government came in and put its thumb on the scale, as I've talked about in a few videos. And so I knew, like, I was in social science, and I knew about areas where a paradigm that was obviously wrong persisted through institutional inertia. But I figured that the reason that this worked was because the consequences weren't really important. But on the stuff that was important, I figured that we'd probably get it right, or at least we have a tendency to get it more right as time goes on, because there's an incentive to. But it turns out, reading this book, I realized it was actually the opposite. It was actually the case that because the incentive was for the government to do something, the government was looking at two hypotheses that seemed equally plausible at the time, although again, only because Ansel Keys committed pretty blatant fraud, that heart disease was caused by either sugar or by saturated fat. And they said, okay, probably saturated fat. And part of it was George McGovern, Senator McGovern, was convinced because of the meat and dairy industry in his state of South Dakota. He's like, they have these lobbying organizations and they're kind of evil, so I'm assuming that they're wrong and it must be the other side that's right. And so the federal government started putting its thumb on the scale. And we knew before that obesity was caused by starch and especially sugar, or practitioners did. And then the government guidelines became that actually obesity is caused by calories and fat has the densest calories, so try to eat a starch-heavy diet. So that really, I was like, wow, holy shit, like this, I was wrong about the assumption that the incentives, when it is important and has real-world consequences, we're going to get it more right. In fact, there's more of an incentive to get things more wrong, especially if the government gets involved. And that fundamentally started to shake my faith in a lot of what I believed about science, especially as it was related to the government. And I came up with the idea for this channel a little bit after this in 2019. And one of the things I wanted to do, which I'll probably do as a single video, but I wanted to do a series of videos that I was going to call Sympathy for Science Deniers, because seeing it in this light, I was suddenly starting to think, okay, a lot of these people I've condemned as science deniers, after learning this, I still don't think they're right, and I still don't think they're right, but I see their position more. And so that really, especially because it had such a big consequence for me, really changed my fundamental view on the reliability of science and of so-called experts and the incentives of scientists and so-called experts, especially when it's related to the government, although I still tended to think about it as the more the government is involved, the bigger the problem, and not really the institutional incentives within science itself, which I'll get to that in another book. And so then in early 2019, and I had read a couple of Gary Taubes' books, book by Tim Noakes, so a lot of this dietary science, and I was realizing it wasn't just saturated fat, it was a lot of dietary science, and I started looking into the literature reviews on exercise science as well, and I realized a lot of that was a lot less clear than I thought. And so then I read this book by James Saw, Seeing Like a State, which again was because of an Atlantic article. And he introduced me to the idea of legibility, basically that large mass institutions, they are not interested in getting things right, they are interested in being predictable. And I already sort of knew this idea with respect to law. Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, it is more important that the law be settled than that the law be settled right. And like the reason that most corporations are based in Delaware and most financial corporations are based in South Dakota is not because they have the most business-friendly laws necessarily, but because they have the most case law for business law in general in Delaware and for financial institutions in South Dakota. And so big businesses can pretty much predict what the outcome of a given court case is going to be in a way that is less predictable in other states. But this was when I realized, no, like mass institutions, the incentives generally are in favor of making stuff legible enough for the people at the top to feel like they have control, even if they are wrong, that it is about getting things right. And of course, it was coming on the heels of reading Nina Teicholz and Gary Taubes and Tim Noakes, a couple of other people too. And I've started to realize this is a general thing. Like, it's not just with government involvement in dietary science. This is like just a general pattern. I sort of extrapolated from what I knew about law and what I had just learned about dietary science to be like, okay, this, like, I have always been skeptical of mass institutions, but they have upsides. And I was sort of indoctrinated in the upsides. And this was when I started to come back to, okay, smallness is good. And I also started reading David Graeber around the same time. And at the time, I kind of thought of Scott and Graeber as counterpoints, but now I realize Graeber is much more of a hardcore leftist, and I group Scott with Nassim Nicholas Taleb and Christopher Lasch. And speaking of Nassim Nicholas Taleb, so I read The Black Swan in 2021, and that was a book that hit me like lightning in terms of, wow, I was just amazed. And it gave me a new framework for thinking about things, which is the idea of extremistan versus mediocristan, as well as the anti-library. I think a few other ideas too. But it was mostly just I enjoyed the book, and it didn't really crystallize anything I was grasping at or shake anything loose in an important way. And then I'd been meaning to read this book for a while, and I finally read it a little after my father died, I think end of 2023. So I guess that would be like a year to a year and a half after he died. And Black Swan was the book that I'd heard about from Taleb, although mostly from people who sort of got what it was saying wrong. And then Anti-Fragile, Taleb says it's his best book, and I agree, I think it's his best book. And so this was a book that, again, shook things loose, crystallized what I was grasping at, and also gave me a new framework. I mean, it gave me multiple frameworks. It gave me the framework of fragility versus anti-fragility, like a spectrum. It gave me the idea of the via negativa, or the idea that it's better to try to do fewer things then try to do more things. It gave me the idea of the Lindy effect and Seneca's barbell, both of which I have made videos about. But it shook loose a lot of smaller assumptions that I sort of made about how mass institutions work that I had sort of hung on to. And I started to, like, even after reading Scott, I'm like, okay, but we still need some of these, and probably the answer is greater if we can figure out, like, greater democratic accountability. And this was when I started to question, is accountability possible in mass institutions at all, given the incentives of people who run them to try to fragilize things in favor of themselves, I guess. And so it completely, like, I would describe it to friends as it felt like I was standing on it like a cliff or a mountain, and like my worldview was falling out from under me, which has happened at least once since then. It was a very disorienting feeling. And this book has so profoundly impacted my worldview with these ideas that he introduces here. And amazingly, even though I read it like 3 years ago and it's been this impactful, I haven't reread it. And I think I need to do the book club scheduling, but I think I'm going to suggest it for the book club at one of the early readings once I've got it established, because of all the books that have like influenced my thinking, this has probably been the biggest impact. And so it's definitely going to be worth, I think, rereading. And so then a little bit after that, I read The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, which clarified what I kind of knew, that I needed to be online less and touch grass more. And then I read this book, Essentialism by Greg McKeown. And this book sort of shook loose my assumption, because I basically said I have 5 things like that I'm sort of prioritizing, which are, I want to start a family and have kids. I want to do creative stuff. I want to teach. I want to learn, and I want to build community. And I sort of treated these as independent in all things I could do, and if it served one of these ends. And then reading this book, like, I've seen other books mentioned too, but the idea that priority is singular and you can really pursue one. And then I combined it with the idea of agency and community. And I'm like, I have, again, try to figure out family and kids is top goal. Creative stuff is the secondary goal, although it's also increasingly becoming instrumental to how I'm trying to achieve the first goal, which I talked about in a few videos. And I realized, and all the other stuff, like if I do teaching, it's going to probably, I guess you call this channel teaching-ish, but, and I'm still learning, but that's something I'm fitting in when I can. But like the main thing is like, if I want to have kids, I want to teach my kids. And community stuff is going to be if I have kids, for like building community stuff for my kids, right? And so it became, okay, I'm basically collapsing all of these 5 things into 1.5 priorities. So my communion priority of family and kids is top, and then my agency priority of creative stuff is sort of secondary, although also instrumental to how I'm trying to do it. And so I read this book like a year after Anti-Fragile, I think. I think I read it towards the end of 2024. No, summer of 2024. It was a little bit after Hurricane Beryl, I think. And then early in 2025, I read this book, Ghost in the Machine by Arthur Koestler. And so Anti-Fragile I'd been questioning the establishment a lot by this point, and I was starting to actively look for anti-establishment thinkers. And unfortunately, this book is out of print, although at least now, like, you can get it used cheap. Although one of the books I'm going to mention, I mentioned several times, and I was recommending it to someone at a reading group, and it was sold out. And I realized with a small print run for a book like that, although it is print on demand, probably the fact that I've been pressing this over multiple videos might be why it sold out. So I hope that mentioning this doesn't result in this book becoming expensive and hard to find, although I would bet if you like go to your local bookstore, like, it was a bestseller at the time, which is why it's cheap now. But anyways, basically, so this was a sequel to his book, The Act of Creation, which is the more fun read. But again, if I'm looking for books that crystallized and clarified something, shook something loose, and also gave me like new frameworks for thinking about things, this is more impactful than Act of Creation. I generally recommend people, if you're going to read this one first, Act of Creation second. And you can read Janus, but I don't think it's nearly as good as the first two, because he was sort of an informal trilogy. And basically the idea here, the big idea in this book is the idea of holons and holarchy. And so a holon is an organization that, for beneath it, it's basically expressing agency looking down. So it's the self-assertive tendency is what he calls it, looking down, and then the self-transcending tendency looking up. And so it sort of seeks to assert agency downwards and engage in communion upwards. And a holon is something that is complete in itself, but also composed of smaller parts and part of a larger whole. And there's a lot connected to this idea in this book. And one of the big things is he's a critic of Darwinian evolution, because he argues that He thinks evolution is more teleological than Darwin gives it credit for, which is a common criticism that I see that I'm starting to think is right. Although I also think he was possibly misreading Darwin a bit. Like, the way that Koestler is promoting teleology is basically, if you have a behavior that an organism has, then it becomes basically pre-adapted to then select for adaptations that promote that behavior and encode it genetically. And I think that is consistent with Darwin. And I think he was taking sort of an overly simplistic view of Darwinian evolution, because Darwin didn't exactly anticipate what Koestler argued here, but I think it's not inconsistent with Darwin having read Origin of Species. And there's other fascinating things too, but the idea of the holons and holarchy, and the idea that, and I'd sort of started to suspect that evolution, both biological and other ways, might have these teleological elements. And this was around the time that I was coming to believe in a higher power, not necessarily in the Christian sense. And I won't get into that here. It's more consistent with Taoism. But this was a book that sort of crystallized this. And it also, at some point I want to make a video on the best books for understanding AI. And even though he's looking at biological organisms, I think his explanations here are sort of a good introduction to why what we're doing with AI is not actually going to create intelligence. Yeah, so I read Koestler early 2025, and then late 2025, I read this book, Leviathan and Its Enemies by Samuel Francis, which was an attempt to update the managerial revolution. And as I talked about, the reason I read this book was because of a video by Kaiser Bouch, which I won't do a card, but I'll link it in the description. And he was like, oh, this sounds like it's answering some of the questions that I've been grasping at. But it also answered questions that I didn't realize I'd been asking. And one of the things that I'd sort of been trying to figure out, but I didn't realize I was trying to figure out, is there is sort of an asymmetry between the political left and political right, where the political right tends to seemingly achieve more of their stated objectives, but the views of the political far left tend to become more acceptable, politics moves there. And basically, the account that he provided that explained that to me is the views of the political left, far left, can be sort of co-opted into the managerial establishment as aspirational, as we'll get there someday, whereas the views of the counter-establishment, which form part of the political right, cannot be co-opted in the same way. And so you sort of co-opt and steer the leadership, but that also requires cooperation on stated objectives, which is, so they basically, it ends up being, because it's a collaboration between the counter-establishment and the right wing of the establishment, again in the US, where the counter-establishment gets wins that the right wing of the establishment feels aren't really going to harm their long-term goals. But this book introduced me to the idea of managerialism and to the idea of hard and soft managerialism. And I think I'd heard the term before, but I didn't really realize what it was. And I had sort of assumed that our economy, our managerial economy, was still an industrial economy. I knew it was switching to service sector work, but I didn't really realize how profound the differences in terms of what mass organizations want are. And this explains, with public school, for example, because that was, I criticized the Prussian industrial education system, but as bad as that was, public schools have gotten worse. And it's because of the managerialist logic, and not just public schools, private schools too. All sort of mass schools have this same logic. And it shook loose. I understood there's clear similarities between big businesses, big governments, and big nonprofits in terms of how they operate and their incentives. But I didn't realize that there was this whole, I was still fundamentally thinking of them as different domains. And this book was when I really realized, no, it's all managerialism, and it all has these same problems. There might be other things that shook loose, but basically, and it shook loose some of my other assumptions that I'm still grasping with the implication of those, so I won't get into them. So yeah, I read this one late 2025, and that was every other book I'm going to talk about as one of these 11 I read this year. And so then the next one that I read, Conflict Divisions by Thomas Sowell, was because I made a list of books that I've been meaning to read and I should, even I think I should read and I haven't. And then I read several of these books immediately after that. And one of these was this book. And I sort of knew what Sowell was saying in a broad sense, which is the idea there's a conflict between the constrained or tragic vision and the unconstrained vision of the anointed. But I didn't really realize how far this went. And I've been someone for a long time, I've sort of recognized a lot of elements of the constrained vision, but I didn't really recognize the degree to which, because I tended to still identify more with the cultural, at least, left. And a lot of people there, and also a lot of libertarians I didn't get along with, were operating under a version of the unconstrained vision. I didn't realize that. And this actually ended up clarifying for me. So I read Arnold Kling's 3 Languages of Politics, which was not one of these books that hit me like a lightning bolt, but I need to explain how it impacted conflict of visions. And so I knew, talking to other libertarians, they tended to think of things in terms of liberty and tyranny in a way that I didn't. So that wasn't a surprise. And then this finally started to explain conservatism to me. And one thing I'm realizing is conservatism, or the right, the political right, is a lot more heterogeneous in its assumptions and the way that it thinks than the political left is, which is one of the reasons I struggle to understand it. But one thing that unites them is what Kling would call the idea of civilization barbarism. So the idea that you are defending civilization against barbarism. And I've been meaning to tweet, and I might do that tonight, that I've noticed it seems like the right tends to make a virtue of necessity and the left tends to make a necessity of virtue, by which I mean that the right tends to celebrate, like I'm coming around to realize, yeah, police, border enforcement, military, they're all more necessary than I would have liked to acknowledge. But the way that the political right often like valorizes and celebrates and excuses the misbehaviors of these groups is off-putting. And meanwhile, the political left comes up with solutions that only work if you can make everybody very virtuous in a specific way that almost nobody actually acts. But I didn't. So he describes the left as talking about things in terms of oppressor and oppressed. And I'm like, I don't think that's right. Like, I know a few people on the left who are like that, but I don't think it's the norm. And it was only after reading Thomas Sowell's Conflict of Visions and then the sequel, Vision of the Anointed, that I really realized, oh no, it is actually the norm. Like, most people who are anti-establishment left and a lot of the establishment left think and talk about things in terms of belonging to a privileged group makes you an oppressor and kind of makes you sinful, and belonging to an oppressed group, and especially if you then have additional like clear oppression, victimization after that, makes you virtuous simply on the basis of that. And if you belong to an oppressor group and are victimized on the basis of that category, then it's, oh, well, you need to do better, scrub, which is one of the ways. I mentioned the left have their own versions of bootstraps that I'm realizing might even be more off-putting than the bootstraps mentality of the right. And I've talked about some of them, and I'm realizing this is another element of that. And so even though I read 3 Languages a while ago and it didn't immediately, like, I didn't buy into what he was saying about the left in general, reading Conflict of Vision, I'm like, oh, Kling was actually right. And I started to see it everywhere and sort of recognize it in these interactions. And I think part of the issue for me is there is an academic sort of liberal establishment interpretation of a lot of these ideas that makes sense on the surface. And then when other parts of academia, when the activists left and when like politicians talk about these things, they mean it in a different way. And I might talk about that in a future video because I'm just introducing these books now. And so then the next 3 books are all books that I read, or this one I read this year too. And then the next 3 books are all books that I also read this year. And so it'll be interesting to see if I still think they're as impactful down the line. But right now, so the first of these is one that I read from a viewer recommendation earlier in the channel, and I've talked about a lot. We've Never Been Woke by Musa Al-Gharbi. And this crystallized, because I'd already sort of been starting to grapple with the realization that I don't relate to how symbolic capitalists operate and think, even though I'm kind of from that class of people. And so he introduced this idea of symbolic capital, symbolic capitalists, which has made a video on that, but the 3 kinds are, so you have political capital, which is like who you know, cultural capital, which is how do you behave, and academic capital, which is what can you present yourself as knowing. And this book ended up also, so it shook loose for me, like, how do I know it shook stuff loose. I'm actually blanking on what it did. Okay, so I remember one of the big things that this book shook loose for me, which is, you'll notice, like, shortly before I started talking about this book, I was talking about, and I had just read, The Almanac of Naval Ravicant, and Robert Sapolsky's A Primate's Memoir, as well as longer ago, I had read The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. And I started connecting them to these ideas that there are 2 kinds of games, which again, finite and infinite games, James Carse played a role in that as well. But reading these 2 books, I realized zero-sum and negative-sum games are primarily status games. The Almanac of Naval Ravicant calls positive-sum games wealth creation games. James Carse calls them infinite games. And Robert Sapolsky sort of highlights that for baboons, status games are largely necessary, but baboons can still choose to play them less or more. But obviously you don't want to be low status, and if you don't play them at all, you will be very low status. And I was sort of concluding, in the world we have, Naval Ravikant is right, and you can just avoid playing status games at all, and you can just play wealth creation, positive sum games. And I might make a video on this, but I think as an autistic person, I'm sort of blind to status in sort of similar way to like color blindness, sort of like status games. And I have to sort of work out what's happening because I don't really see it. I'm also face blind, incidentally. And so it's not clear to me, have I placed a low value on status because I didn't understand how it happened and didn't understand how to use it? Or do I not understand those things because I placed a low value on it? But regardless, I tended to I've always had an instinct to not want to play status games, not try to play status games, zero-sum games, and think I could and should avoid that. And reading We've Never Been Woke by Musa Al-Gharbi and introducing me to this idea of symbolic capital made me realize that status is, because I talked about, like, I want money, I want enough money to sort of live the life I want to live, but I don't really care about money for its own sake or like money for status things. And status, like, I was like, I have no need for that. And I started to realize, I need to do this kind of instrumentally. And then as this book sunk in, I realized, no, to some degree, I need to play certain status games. And a lot of the time, the way you play it the right way, the winning move is not to play. But there are also, like, there are things that I do in these videos, and I want to make a video on counter signaling at some point, that are me deliberately kind of playing a certain kind of status game. And again, like money, I see it now as like functional, transactional to the life I want to live and not as an end in itself. But this book led to me finally rejecting the sort of rejection of the merit of status, because I realized that status is something that you can spend in the same way you can spend money, and that you need it to achieve certain things. And I, to some degree, got lucky in that I sometimes accidentally do things that look like I'm playing status games the right way, or it's unintelligible, so that gets rewarded. But my life would have been a lot easier if I'd understood it. And I think I mentioned in a video, like, there are multiple times that it seems like I was basically, they were trying to recruit me into the elite, into the ranks of the symbolic capitalists, but I needed to like do or say the right thing, and I didn't realize that. And reading Musa Al-Gharbi, I realized, like, I wouldn't want that because I don't want to live this kind of lifestyle. But like the thing that shook loose for me, the big thing, was just how essentially unavoidable, how necessary these status games are on some level, as well as in contrast to the other books, like a lot of the games that people play are unnecessary, and they either get trapped or they enjoy them in a way that I don't. So anyways, that was at least one of the big things that this book shook loose for me. But it also crystallized, it changed some of my assumptions about like how the world works and how symbolic capitalists think, because I interacted with these people and I thought I understood them, and I realized I didn't. It introduced me to this idea, which comes from Pierre Bourdieu, who I've been meaning to read. So it introduced me to this new framework of the idea of symbolic capital. It crystallized and clarified like my realization that I didn't relate to how other symbolic capitalists think. And it shook loose for me, like, I had sort of thought I could potentially, and now I'm getting back to maybe I could, but at least for the moment, it was like, it made me realize I don't want to be part of this world. And I've been like living by the standards of these people, living by the standards of midwits, who I'm more willing to say, I would call a midwit like a specific kind of symbolic capitalist generally. And I started to realize, I actually, like, big part of my problem has been trying to live according to the standards of these people who don't live according to their own stated standards a lot of the time. And when they do, they're often standards that they're self-serving in their own interests. And so, like, I've talked about this one a lot. And then I've talked about this book a lot, and this is the one that turned out to be sold out when I was recommending to someone in person, Logic of Liberty by Michael Polanyi, and it is Lightning Source, so it is print on demand, so it should come back in. But this one, Michael Polanyi did a few things. So, two things that I didn't really realize. So I assumed I didn't fit into academia, and then I realized I don't fit into modern academia because of how it has been reshaped for managerialism and to serve midwits. And there was a version of academia that I would have fit into, and even like 30 years ago, I still might have made it in there. But by the time I was trying to do my PhD, I knew the way that professors worked, like the adjunctification and all that, and the publisher perish. I didn't want to be doing it because I wanted to pursue my own interests, and I didn't even get my PhD. I made a video on that. But if I'd been like 60 years ago, I probably would have been in academia because it was like, before World War II and just after, it was much friendlier to people who were, like, curious and able to do academic research, but not really toe the line. And academia has become increasingly more about towing the department line and being legible, being selectively legible to their peers and superiors. And the other thing about this book is, so he gave me this new framework of what he calls polycentric problems and their computability. I've made a blog post about this. I don't think I've talked about it in videos. But that is a new framework that has been really, basically he argues polycentric problems, there's a practical limitation on computability, which is increasing. And then there's an absolute limit, which is at about 150, which happens to be Dunbar's number. And I think there's some really interesting implications from this. And then the other thing is, this was when I realized, like, I know people who criticize and say, like, peer review isn't science. And I'm like, what? Shouldn't that be more scientific? And I'm realizing peer review is about basically making things more legible and consistent for the managerial elite, as opposed to actually doing good science. And I had read Paul Feyerabend's Against Method, and I liked it in principle, but I didn't really get the implications until I read this book, and it kind of crystallized things for me. And then the most recent one, and I'm still grappling with the implications for this, is The Fatal Conceit, The Errors of Socialism by Friedrich Hayek. And while he's criticizing socialism, he is also sort of implicitly criticizing managerialism as well, while also kind of endorsing it. And so the big thing for me is in this book, Hayek acknowledges markets depend on a strong state and a strong bureaucracy, which goes against the conventional libertarian belief that markets and states are in conflict. And so reading that fundamentally, and I'd all read Francis Fukuyama's Liberalism and Its Discontents, because I've been sort of questioning, like, philosophical liberalism and some of the implications for a while now, and I found it very uncompelling. But this one, Hayek's argument in favor of emergent order, which I think he calls spontaneous order, is very compelling. And so as a defense of spontaneous order, it crystallizes and clarifies. But the big thing for me is that Hayek's acknowledgement that markets depend on governments, which he did in passing, made me realize and so William Easterly, in his book one of his books criticizing development, talks about people misunderstand Hayek and they think of him as a free marketeer, but he is actually a critic of, like, social engineering and bigness in general, I think is how Easterly described it. But Hayek acknowledges there's a contradiction because these systems of spontaneous order make us all richer and better off, but you also have both a practical and a political drive to regulate these systems, which tends to destroy them, and you need to regulate them to at least some degree, like with markets, to keep them functional. And so this book, and there might be others, like, as I think back on, I'm like, oh, these have also sort of reshaken me, but this was the one where I really started, because up until this point, I was, like, looking at John Gray, Two-Faced Liberalism. I'm like, okay, we can maybe reinvent philosophical liberalism on a more local scale. But this fundamentally shifted me to starting questioning the foundation of liberalism. The other thing that it shook loose for me is he basically says that to even have these benefits of emergent order, you need inequality, which is, like, manifestly unjust if you are planning it, but it's just unavoidable if you're not planning it. And that also started me so this book, basically, I had mentioned, so John Gray defines 4 elements of liberalism, which are individualism, egalitarianism, universalism, and meliorism, or the belief that you can sort of systematically, deliberately improve society. And I usually add rationalism. And I said by 2023, I had lost my faith in 3 of those, but I held on to individualism and egalitarianism. And so reading this book shook loose. It has me starting questioning both my assumptions, my faith in individualism and egalitarianism at the same time. And I don't know, reading a lot, trying to still come to terms with that. So anyways, these are, as I said, 11 books that hit me like a lightning bolt in terms of immediate impact, where they shook something loose, gave me a new framework for thinking about things, and crystallized or clarified something all at once. And it's the first books. There's often I've read other books that sort of helped in this thinking, and some of them built on them. But if I was to try to do all of those relevant books, it would be 30, 40, 50 plus books. So anyways, I'm Magpie. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.